the deadliest pandemic of all time. The influenza lasted from 1918 to 1919 and was responsible for 20 to 40 million deaths. This disease occurred in three main waves. First, it emerged in Kansas in the spring of 1918. The second wave, also the worst, came in the fall of 1918, while the last wave came in the spring of 1919. More people died of the influenza in 1 year than the bubonic plague had killed in 4 years. 675,000 Americans died, more casualties than during the Civil War. Although its origins remain unknown, the influenza may have resulted from a genetic shift, creating a new virus. In contrast to other influenza strains, this influenza targeted people with the strongest immune systems, as well as the young and the old. As a result, the healthy 19 to 40-year-olds, including those involved in the war, were heavily affected. Constant traveling by the Navy and Army were main contributors to the speed at which the influenza spread. Sailors fell sick in large numbers as they were trapped on ships with the virus, while the soldiers brought the illness to the civilians. A shortage of physicians created by the load of military patients led the Red Cross to form a national committee on influenza. Equipped with medicinal supplies, nurses, and volunteers, it was dispatched to military and civilian sectors. Meanwhile, the United States Public Health Service received government funding for research and attempted to mobilize forces against the pandemic. However, the thousands of meetings and rallies organized only served to spread the sickness. Combined with perception of false data, lack of organization, and insufficient resources, the USPHS failed to create positive impact. Numerous cartoons and posters were printed to raise public awareness of the pandemic and issue directives. Unfortunately, the language was confusing, especially for the immigrant population, which had limited understanding of English. Lastly, the government moved to prevent the disease from spreading by enforcing health measures. Those without face masks were fined and sometimes even jailed, while quarantines were imposed in various areas. For example, in Washington, D.C., a law was passed prohibiting people from leaving their house. Though this infringed upon civilian rights, it was justified as it benefited the greater population. Though a general lack of economic data prevents consensuses regarding the economic effect of the pandemic, newspapers from that time provide an insight into the situation. Merchants in Little Rock, Arkansas, were reported to have estimated 40 to 70% declines in business, while other businesses lost $10,000 a day on average. Meanwhile, in Memphis, Tennessee, industrial plants suffered from loss of workers, while coal mines reported a 50% decrease in production. In conclusion, the economic effects of the influenza 1918 were short-term, but still detrimental enough to cause double-digit losses in revenue. No sphere of American life was more impacted by the 1918 pandemic than society. From a perspective of well-being alone, the pandemic was devastating. Killing 0.66% of the U.S. population, it decreased life expectancy for both men and women by 11.8 years. Due to the high contagiousness of the influenza, mortality rates were heavier for more densely populated areas. On the other hand, extensive research has proven that personal income, climate, and geography had no effect on mortality rates. Family formation and fertility were hugely impacted, as many young adults and middle-aged people passed away. In addition to destruction of family life, public utilities such as schools and churches emptied. Trash went uncollected by the streets. mail piled up, and telephone services became deserted as the workforce fell sick. After the first wave of the influenza, no action was taken to prepare for a second wave. This was a result of the pandemic occurring at the exact time of the war. The existence of the war meant that people did not really question the cause of so many deaths, as the war and the pandemic blurred into one event. Another factor in the indifference towards the pandemic was that it was not a long-lasting disease. Unlike syphilis or cancer, this pandemic only lasted for 2 years, not nearly long enough to retain notoriety. In conclusion, though the influenza of 1918 was the most devastating epidemic of the world since the Middle Ages and significantly impacted society and economy, it was largely ignored in its time because of its association with World War I.